2025 was a huge year for mystery and cold case fans. At least two cases that had gone unsolved for more than 20 years finally broke open. One was the 1999 Nagoya housewife murder I covered last time. The other is today's case, the Sinjong-dong Mashimaro Incident. It began with something almost ridiculous, a battered shoe cabinet on a second-floor walkway, with a cute Mashimaro sticker stuck to its side. For years, that tiny rabbit was the only clear image a survivor could cling to, the one detail she remembered while fighting to escape. And for 2 decades, detectives chased that rabbit, trying to pull a series of crimes into the light. Then, in 2025, the truth finally surfaced, and the case twisted in a way no one expected. The man identified as the killer of the 2005 murders was already serving a prison sentence when the later abduction happened. So, who else was hiding inside that Mashimaro stickered room? Let me tell you the story. June 7, 2005, the first workday in South Korea after a public holiday ended. People returned to their jobs, and the city slipped back into its normal rhythm. At around 10 a.m., Mr. Huang began his routine patrol in the Sinjong-dong neighborhood. The alleys here were narrow, and the residential blocks were tightly packed, mostly small multi-family homes. There was no centrally managed trash room, so certain corners, beneath a utility poles or along a school wall, became the neighborhood's common dumping corners. Mr. Huang was a municipal worker assigned to the Sinjong-dong Community Center, and it was his job to collect and clear the illegally dumped garbage from those areas. Pushing his cart, he entered a small alley behind Sinmok Elementary School. He had barely reached the entrance when a mountain of trash caught his attention. The most noticeable items were 2 pale yellow rice sacks tied mouth to mouth with rope. Mr. Huang stepped closer and saw something sticking out. Something that looked like part of an arm, with crooked chipped nail polish painted on it. He assumed it was a discarded mannequin and didn't think much of it, but when he tried to pick it up and toss it into his cart, it was far heavier than he expected. Feeling uneasy, he touched the exposed part again and suddenly realized this was not a mannequin at all. He called the police. Officers arrived quickly and secured the scene. Inside the rice sack was the body of a young woman with no signs of life. A black plastic bag had been pulled over her head. Forensic examination later concluded she died by suffocation, and her breakfast was still undigested. Investigators estimated the time of death as the previous afternoon, between 3 p.m. and 4 p.m. There were signs of injury, but they were unable to recover the killer's DNA. Police soon identified the victim, Ms. Kwan, 25 years old, an office worker. Her family said they had breakfast together at 9 a.m. on June 6th. Around noon, Ms. Kwan developed cold-like symptoms, left home alone to go to the hospital, and never returned. The alley where she was found had no CCTV, making it nearly impossible to reconstruct her final route. Police went door to door interviewing local residents, focusing especially on anyone who had dumped trash around that time. But everyone said the same thing. They heard nothing unusual and saw no suspicious person. Because the dumping site was only about 1.2 miles from Ms. Kwan's home, it looked like the kind of case that usually points to someone close, an acquaintance, a spur-of-the-moment attack, a quick disposal nearby. To investigators, that kind of detail can signal shame, guilt, or a twisted sense of intimacy. Based on that, police initially suspected the killer was someone she knew. Police looked into Ms. Kwan's personal relationships, but found nothing that pointed to a clear suspect. She was described as gentle, with a small social circle, and no known grudges or conflicts with anyone. With her connections leading nowhere, investigators shifted their focus back to the scene. The key physical evidence was the 2 pale yellow rice sacks. Parts of the printed text on the sacks had been deliberately blacked out with a thick black marker, an obvious attempt to hide where they came from. But after forensic restoration, police were able to make out a place name printed on the bags, Nonsan, a city in South Korea. Police immediately traveled to Nonsan and launched a large-scale sweep of local rice mills and distributors. But they quickly ran into a wall. These rice sacks were extremely common, widely circulated, and often reused for other purposes, like hauling waste at construction sites. With poor purchase records and limited surveillance systems, there was no way to identify who had bought the sacks in the first place. And with that key lead cut off, the investigation slowly began to stall. 6 months later, police in Sinjongdong received another report. A man said he had found something unusual in a parking lot inside a residential area. The caller was a restaurant owner who lived nearby. At around 9 a.m., as he passed the lot, he noticed a large white bundle on the ground. At first, he assumed someone had dumped bulky trash, but the way it was placed looked wrong. He walked up and kicked it lightly. It felt strangely soft. He called the police immediately. When officers arrived, they found the bundle tightly bound with rope and electrical wire. The outer layer was a straw mat, the middle layer was a large transparent plastic sheet, and inside was the body of a woman, her head, once again, covered with a black plastic bag. Forensic examination confirmed she had died of suffocation, and her body showed multiple signs of injury. After identification, the victim was confirmed to be Ms. Lee, 42 years old. She lived with her husband and 2 children. Her husband said that the day before, at 8:40 a.m., she left home for work as usual. After she got off work, he lost contact with her. That evening, when she didn't come home, he assumed she had stayed the night at her parents' house and didn't press the issue. But as the night passed with no message, his anxiety grew. He was about to call the police when the devastating news arrived. Investigators later confirmed the couple had a good relationship. The husband had no clear motive, and he had an alibi. The parking lot where Ms. Lee was found had no CCTV. Police pulled surveillance footage from the surrounding area on a large scale and determined her last confirmed sighting. 4 p.m. on November 20th, standing on an escalator at Sinjong Station, most likely on her way home after work. Police canvassed nearby residents but found no valuable leads. One detail stood out. Ms. Lee's clothing was covered with heavy mold. Testing confirmed the mold didn't originate from the fabric itself. It came from the environment. It suggested she'd been kept somewhere dark and damp, somewhere like a basement. And it was this second case that completely shifted the direction of the investigation. The cause of death was the same for Ms. Kwan and Ms. Lee. Both appeared unusually clean, almost as if they had been carefully wiped down. Their bodies and heads were wrapped and concealed in a similar way. The method was strikingly consistent. But most importantly, the way the bundles were tied was professional and identical. It wasn't something an ordinary person could easily do. Police concluded both murders were committed by the same perpetrator. Ms. Kwan and Ms. Lee lived in different worlds. Their social circles didn't overlap, which meant this was not an acquaintance crime. It was random, serial violence. The 2 dumping sites were only about 1.2 miles apart. Both were in busy, high-traffic areas. Yet both were blind spots with no cameras, and at night, leaving something there could easily be dismissed as illegal trash dumping without raising suspicion. It suggested the killer likely lived nearby and knew the area extremely well. Based on the distinctive way the bodies were wrapped and tied, police believed the killer was likely someone with professional experience, possibly in construction or interior remodeling, logistics packaging, or any job that involved specialized bundling and secure tying. But at the time, surveillance systems were still limited. Many migrant and temporary workers weren't officially registered at their addresses. And once again, the investigation hit a wall. Before police could identify the person behind the first 2 murders, a new case erupted in Sinjongdong. On May 31st, 2006, an emergency one-day public holiday, Ms. Park had plans to meet her boyfriend at Mokdong Station to go shopping. She took a bus, but she was so absorbed in a mobile game that she missed her stop. She didn't get off until Sinjong Station. The distance between the 2 stations was only about 0.4 miles, so she decided to walk back toward Mokdong Station along the main road. Suddenly, a man shouted, trying to get her attention. Seeing he was a stranger, Ms. Park ignored him and kept walking. But what she didn't expect was how fast he moved. He took a few long strides, caught up to her, grabbed control of her, and threatened her to stay quiet. Ms. Park panicked. Afraid he would hurt her, she had no choice but to follow him into a narrow alley. When she saw 2 pedestrians approaching from the opposite direction, she screamed immediately, hoping they would help. The pedestrians stopped and asked what was happening, but the man stayed calm and said, "She's my girlfriend. She's drunk. That's why she's screaming." And tragically, they bought it. They didn't question it further, and they hurried away. And just like that, Ms. Park was taken into a semi-basement unit of an apartment building. A semi-basement is half below ground and half above it, with a small window near street level. often so low it sits around knee height for people walking outside. These units are commonly rented by lower-income residents. If you've seen the Korean film Parasite, the main family lives in exactly this kind of semi-basement. The moment Ms. Park was brought inside, she heard the TV and radio turned up loud. Then she heard another person's voice from inside the room. "You're here?" The man gave a brief reply. After a while, he stood up and said he was going to the bathroom. Ms. Park looked around and noticed the door wasn't locked. It was only loosely closed. In that moment, she had one thought: run. She didn't bolt straight out to the main street. Instead, she slipped out, climbed the stairs along the side of the building to the second floor, and hid behind a shoe cabinet. Within minutes, the two men from the semi-basement ran out and chased toward the street. Only after they were gone and everything fell silent did she dare to leave. She sprinted to a nearby elementary school, called her boyfriend for help, and ultimately escaped. Later, Ms. Park told police she had seen a large amount of rope inside the semi-basement, far more than any normal household would need. The two men, she believed, might have jobs related to rope or packaging, which matched the suspected profile from the first two murders. She also noted that the floor and walls in the semi-basement weren't tiled, bare cement was exposed, and the bathroom was extremely crude. Investigators had previously found cement particles on the bodies in the first two cases. And because of how semi-basement units are built, in rainy seasons, water can seep in through the low window, making the room damp and prone to mold. That lined up with the heavy mold found on Ms. Lee's clothing in the second case. Most importantly, all three incidents happened on public holidays, all in the Sinjungdong area, and the time gap between them was around 6 months. Police concluded all three incidents were connected, and that the same offender was behind them. That made Ms. Park, the only survivor, their most critical breakthrough. According to her, the man was around 5'9", tall, lean but solidly built, and roughly in his 30s. His eyebrows were extremely thick, as so thick they looked almost drawn on. Even with a composite sketch, he was still just one face in a sea of people. If investigators could find his address, it could change everything. But Ms. Park had been threatened and forced into survival mode. She was in a state of shock, intensely focused on staying alive, with no chance to memorize the route or pinpoint the exact location of the semi-basement. After the incident, she also developed PTSD, and many details slipped out of reach. Still, Ms. Park gave police one more clue. While hiding behind the shoe cabinet on the second floor, she noticed how old it was. The paint was peeling. On top sat a strangely shaped flower pot that didn't look store-bought, but more like something made by a child. And on the side of the cabinet was a sticker, a well-known rabbit character, Mashimaro. That's why the case later became widely known as the Sinjungdong Mashimaro Incident. Based on Ms. Park's account, the run from the semi-basement to the elementary school hadn't taken long, so police narrowed their search to a radius of a few kilometers around the school. But the area was densely residential, with thousands of households, making any house-to-house search nearly impossible. Worse still, police couldn't obtain a blanket search warrant for an entire neighborhood based on estimation alone. That meant they couldn't force entry into private homes. All they could do was observe from the outside, waiting for moments when residents opened doors or windows, and trying to glimpse inside to see if anything matched Ms. Park's description. With leads coming in slowly and forensic technology at the time still limited, the investigation never achieved a real breakthrough. 7 years later, the case was officially classified as a cold case, and active investigation was suspended. Then, in 2015, exactly 10 years after the first murder, a Korean investigative documentary program aired an episode on the case. Public attention surged again, and a nationwide wave of citizen-led manhunts and tip-offs followed. Not long after, South Korea passed an amendment to its criminal procedure laws, removing the statute of limitations for murder, bringing a new sliver of hope that cold cases like this could be reopened. Around the same time, the Sinjungdong case was adapted into the Korean drama Signal, sparking intense discussion once again. In 2016, the Seoul Metropolitan Police Agency formed a dedicated cold case unit. They retested the physical evidence from the first case and found a mixed DNA profile, more than one contributor, but still couldn't identify any of them. Then came November 21st, 2025, 20 years after the first murder. Police announced a bombshell. They had identified the killer behind the two 2005 murders. This time, modern forensic testing delivered what investigators never had back then: a single usable male DNA profile. And it didn't just point to a suspect, it confirmed the same person was responsible for both killings. Because cement particles were found on both victims' clothing, investigators initially focused on people who worked with concrete, especially construction and renovation crews in and around Xinjiang. To narrow the search, they used offender profiling research and prioritized individuals with similar prior records. They collected and compared DNA from 1,514 people, yet not a single match emerged. After that, police expanded the search to deceased individuals. Eventually, they zeroed in on a man named Jang Yong-jo. He had been in his 60s at the time of the murders and had 3 prior criminal convictions. Back then, he worked as a building manager in a Xinjiang complex. Although he worked in Xinjiang, his official registered address in government records was not in the area, meaning he had never been included in the original screening pool. And because Zhang had died 10 years earlier, obtaining DNA was difficult. Investigators visited 40 medical facilities he had been to in his lifetime, and finally located a usable sample at one hospital. The comparison result came back conclusive. His DNA perfectly matched the DNA recovered from the crime evidence. Police then dug deeper into Zhang's background and found that he had previously worked for a military investigative agency. That helped explain how he could tie professional-grade knots and why he seemed to have strong counter-investigation instincts. After leaving that work, he served as a security guard at an apartment building in Xinjiang. He knew the neighborhood well and could easily identify blind spots with no cameras. Later, he became the manager of that same building. That building housed multiple clinics. Investigators confirmed that both victims from the first 2 cases had medical visit records there. And because Zhang worked 24-hour rotating shifts with other staff, he would have had a window of time, especially before shift changes, to commit the crimes. Police searched the building and found something chilling. The place hadn't undergone any major renovations in 20 years, meaning its condition was largely unchanged from the time of the murders. Investigators discovered mold in the soil on the floor that matched the type found on the victims. They also found nylon rope on site, similar to the rope used to bind the bodies. The building's second basement level had once been a nightclub. By the time of the murders, it had already been abandoned, with only basic water facilities left behind. Police believe that after each crime, Jang Yong-jo used this space to thoroughly wash away and erase any traces left on the victims. Taken together, the evidence confirmed it. Jang Yong-jo was the killer behind the 2 2005 murders. But there was a critical twist. Jang Yong-jo was not the perpetrator of the 3rd case. 3 months before the 3rd incident, he had been arrested for a separate crime. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. A woman named Choi Eun-jin had caught a cold and decided to see a doctor. She had heard that some clinics inside that same building still accepted patients on weekends, so she went there alone. When she took the elevator up to the clinic floor, she found the entire hallway dark and the clinic doors were closed, so she stepped back into the elevator to return to the 1st floor. As the elevator descended, it stopped on a middle floor. The doors opened, and Jang Yong-jo walked in. He introduced himself as the building manager. Then he told Choi Eun-jin that the main entrance on the 1st floor had already been locked, and that the only way out was through the 2nd basement level. Choi believed him and went with him down to B2. But when the elevator doors opened, she froze. It was extremely dark. The floor was cluttered with scattered junk. Next to the elevator was a space sealed off behind a metal gate, like something that had been abandoned for years. She immediately sensed something was wrong and tried to turn back into the elevator to go upstairs. That's when Jang pulled out a knife. Choi begged him, saying she would give him all her money. But Jang replied, "Do you really think I'm doing this for money?" Then he stepped forward, trying to drag her out of the elevator. Choi fought back with everything she had. In the struggle, she shoved him. He lost his balance and fell backward. In that split second, Choi bolted. She ran straight to the 1st floor, only to find the main door really was locked. She pounded on the glass and screamed for help. Thankfully, a few passers-by heard her and gathered outside. What happened next was shocking. Jang Yong-jo himself opened the 1st floor door. He walked over as if nothing had happened, trying to play the role of a helpful, clueless building manager. And in that moment, Choi was so focused on escaping that she didn't even realize the man opening the door for her was the same man who had just tried to drag her into the darkness. When police questioned him, Jang remained eerily calm, showing no panic at all. In the end, thanks to Choi's brave identification, he was sentenced to 3 years and 6 months in prison. In 2006, Ms. Park was abducted into a semi-basement unit, but at that time, Jang Yong-jo was already serving a prison sentence. So, in the follow-up investigation, police shifted their attention to Jang's social connections and eventually zeroed in on a man with the surname Bae. According to police findings, Bae had been Jang's long-term live-in roommate. The two men had rented a semi-basement unit together in Sinjong-dong. Investigators also confirmed that Bae had multiple prior convictions for sexual offenses. And while Yang was in prison, Bae continued living in the same unit they had shared. That explained why, during the time Jang was incarcerated, Ms. Park still saw piles of rope inside that semi-basement, and why, during her escape, she spotted the old shoe cabinet upstairs with the Mashimaro sticker on its side. In Ms. Park's case, police summoned Bae for questioning multiple times. Bae admitted he had lived with Jang and that he knew the surrounding area extremely well, but he completely denied taking part in or carrying out the abduction. And because the neighborhood had little to no surveillance at the time, and because Ms. Park, years later, could not provide 100% certainty in an identification, and because no direct biological evidence linked Bae to the scene, prosecutors never had enough to name him as the primary defendant in court. The first 2 murders aren't out of time. The suspect is dead, so there can be no trial. And because the third case wasn't a homicide, the remaining charges still had a statute of limitations. And that deadline has passed. Legally, it's closed. On paper, it's closed. In real life, it isn't. So 20 years later, even though modern DNA science was able to identify Jang Yong-jo, the limits of legal evidence and the clock of prosecution deadlines mean one question can't be definitively answered in court. What exactly was Bae's role in this series of crimes? And did he act alone in the later abduction? Without hard courtroom-level proof, the justice system can no longer confirm it. The truth may have been partially restored in 2025, but for the victims' families, it was still an ending with missing pieces.